My name is Marcus. I'm a 51-year-old commercial real estate entrepreneur, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of how my second wife's betrayal, calculated, cold, and breathtakingly arrogant, collided with a wall of legal protection she never even knew existed. It's the story of how I went from blindsided husband to the man who watched an entire scheme unravel in real time, piece by devastating piece. And I want you to hear every single detail, because this isn't just about money. It's about trust, identity, and the quiet power of a man who had already survived the worst kind of loss once before and refused to be destroyed a second time. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning matters more than you might think. Before there was a second marriage, there was a first. Before there was betrayal, there was a grief so deep it rewired everything about how I moved through the world. My first wife, Renata, was the kind of woman who made ordinary days feel like something worth remembering. We met young, built everything together from the ground up, and I genuinely believed, the way only the truly lucky believe, that we had been given something rare. Decades of genuine partnership. The kind of love that doesn't perform itself for other people, but just quietly exists in the background of every decision you make together. And then she got sick. The disease that took Renata was an autoimmune condition that the doctors explained with clinical efficiency in a cold office room, while I sat there trying to understand why the universe had aimed itself at her specifically. What followed were years of fighting, medical appointments, experimental treatments, specialists who offered cautious hope, and then quietly withdrew it. I watched the woman I had built my entire adult life alongside become someone who needed more and more care, and I gave it willingly, without hesitation, because that's what love looks like when it's real. But the financial reality of long-term serious illness in this country is brutal in ways that people don't talk about enough. By the time Renata passed away, the savings I had believed were solid had been significantly eroded. Medical bills, end-of-life care, costs that compound quietly until one day you look at what's left and barely recognize it. The grief after Renata's death was not something I could have prepared for. I don't think grief ever announces itself honestly before it arrives. I remember sitting in our house for the first few weeks and feeling like the silence itself had weight, like the air had become something I had to push through rather than breathe. I was financially wounded and emotionally shattered, and the combination of those two things hardened something in me that I think had always been soft before. I made a decision, not out of bitterness, not out of anger at Renata or at life, but out of a cold, clear-eyed recognition that I had been financially vulnerable in a way I never wanted to experience again. I threw myself entirely into rebuilding. I expanded my commercial real estate business with a focus and intensity that I had never applied to anything before. I worked hours that other people would have found unreasonable. I reinvested aggressively. I hired a sharp attorney and an equally sharp financial advisor, and together we constructed a legal architecture around my assets that would protect everything I was rebuilding from the various risks that come with operating in the commercial world. Business litigation, tenant liability, market exposure, divorce. Every vulnerability was addressed with a legal structure designed to insulate my wealth from claims that could otherwise undo years of work in a courtroom in a single afternoon. The house I eventually renovated and paid off was owned by an LLC I controlled. My investment accounts were held in trusts. My business interests were structured through entities that were separate from my personal name in ways that were entirely standard for someone in my industry. But that would also prove critically important years later in ways I couldn't have anticipated at the time. My family watched all of this rebuilding with a mixture of admiration and concern. My sister Elena, in particular, kept a close eye on me during those years. She would call regularly, show up unexpectedly with food, and gently, persistently make the argument that I was disappearing into my work in ways that weren't healthy. She told me, more than once, that Renata would not have wanted me to seal myself off from the possibility of love again, that I was too young, too full of life, too genuinely good a person to spend the rest of my years alone in an office running numbers and expanding portfolios. I resisted this for a long time. The emotional vulnerability of loving someone, of building something with them, and then potentially losing it, felt like a risk I simply wasn't willing to take again. But Elena is persistent in the particular way that only older sisters can be, and eventually, after years of gentle pressure from her and the rest of my family, I agreed to attend a social event she had organized where she promised to introduce me to some women she thought I might find interesting. I went without expectations. I told myself I was going to satisfy my family's concern about my isolation, maybe make a few useful business contacts, and then go home to the apartment I was using for work travel and forget about the entire thing. That was before I met Vivian. She was 27 years old the night Elena introduced us, and I want to be honest here. She was striking in a way that immediately made me aware of myself in a way I hadn't been in years. But it wasn't just her appearance that held my attention. It was the quality of her conversation. She asked questions that suggested genuine curiosity rather than social performance. She had a master's degree in communications and worked for a mid-sized firm, and she spoke about her work and her interests with a confidence that made the 16-year age difference between us feel far less significant than I had expected it would. We talked for most of that evening. When the event ended, I found myself not wanting the conversation to stop. Our courtship developed slowly and carefully over the months that followed, which was entirely my doing. I was honest with Vivian about my reluctance, about the grief I had carried for years, about the emotional walls I had built around myself. And to her credit, and I want to give her credit where it's genuine, she was patient with all of it. She never pushed me to move faster than I was comfortable moving. She never made me feel like my caution was a flaw or an obstacle. She seemed to genuinely want to build something real rather than rush into a commitment for the sake of having one. We married after 2 years of dating. And for the first 4 years of our marriage, I believed with everything I had that I had made the right decision. Vivian was warm, engaged, attentive. She was supportive during the wedding planning in ways that showed she was thoughtful about the fact that I had been married before. She moved into my house and made it her own in ways that felt collaborative rather than territorial. We established routines together, Sunday breakfasts, evening walks, dinner parties with friends. We traveled when we could. We built something that felt, from the inside, like a genuine partnership. I was happy, genuinely, quietly, deeply happy in the way that feels earned rather than accidental. But somewhere around year 5, things began to shift in ways I first noticed as subtle and then couldn't stop noticing. It started with comments. Small ones at first. Vivian would mention a couple we knew who had just bought a larger house, and there would be something in her tone, not quite dissatisfaction, but a kind of wistfulness that hadn't been there before. She started talking more about vacations that her new friends were taking, luxury trips to European cities and private resort destinations that we hadn't prioritized because I had always lived well within my means, preferring financial security to conspicuous spending. Vivian's social circle had shifted. The friends she spent her time with now were women married to men in high-income professions, finance, medicine, law. And their conversations, as far as I could tell from what Vivian reported back, centered heavily on shopping, designer labels, expensive restaurants, and the particular kind of social currency that comes from being seen spending money freely. These were not the friends Vivian had had when we first met. These were new acquisitions, and their influence on her priorities was not subtle. The requests for budget adjustments started coming with increasing frequency. More money for clothes, more for entertainment, more for the kinds of social outings that her new circle expected everyone to participate in. Vivian began arguing that we could afford a more extravagant lifestyle, that my conservative approach to spending was holding us back, that the way we lived didn't reflect my actual level of success, and was preventing her from fully participating in the social world that had become important to her. These conversations were some of the most frustrating I had ever experienced in a relationship, because at the core of them was an assumption that I found both revealing and deeply troubling. Vivian seemed to have arrived at the belief that my wealth was simply available to her, that decades of my risk-taking, my sacrifice, my early mornings and late nights and years of working through grief to rebuild what I had lost were simply a resource she could access without having contributed to creating it. She kept referring to my assets as ours in a way that ignored the entire history of how those assets had come to exist. I tried to address these concerns directly. I raised the idea of counseling. I suggested we sit down together and talk honestly about what each of us needed from our marriage and what we were both willing to put in. Vivian would engage with these conversations briefly and then retreat back into the same patterns within weeks. The emotional distance between us grew. She began staying out later on weekends with her new friends, returning home at hours that felt less like social events, and more like active avoidance. She became less and less interested in the physical and emotional intimacy that had once been one of the strongest parts of our connection, claiming exhaustion or preoccupation whenever I tried to close the gap that was forming between us. I want to be honest about what it feels like to watch a marriage deteriorate in slow motion. It's not dramatic at first. It doesn't arrive with a confrontation or a revelation. It's more like watching a color fade. You keep looking at it, trying to remember what it used to look like, telling yourself it's still there, until one day you look up and realize the original color is entirely gone, and you've been staring at something pale and unfamiliar for much longer than you realized. I was still trying to figure out how to address what was happening between us when Vivian sat me down on a Tuesday evening and told me she wanted a divorce. She delivered the news in the carefully measured language of someone who had rehearsed it. She talked about growing apart, about needing to find herself, about wanting the freedom to pursue her own goals and interests without the constraints of our partnership. She was calm, almost clinical, and that calmness, that complete absence of grief or conflict in her delivery, was somehow the most painful part of the entire conversation. I was blindsided in a way I hadn't expected to be. Looking back now, I can see all the signs I should have recognized. But in the moment, sitting across from the woman I had opened myself up to after years of protective isolation, hearing her tell me that our marriage was over with the emotional temperature of someone canceling a subscription service, I felt the floor drop out from under me. I suggested counseling. I suggested a trial separation, some space to breathe and reconsider. I told her I was willing to work on whatever she felt wasn't working. Vivian was unmoved. She had made her decision, she said. She wanted the divorce finalized as quickly as possible, and she hoped I would cooperate rather than complicate the process. Despite the hurt, and it was real, it was deep, I committed to handling the divorce with as much dignity as I could manage. I told Vivian that I wanted her to be taken care of after our marriage ended, that I was willing to be generous in our settlement to ensure she could transition to independence comfortably. I even offered to move out of the house and let her remain there while we worked through the proceedings. I had a small apartment I used for business travel, and I was willing to relocate temporarily if it made the process less painful for both of us. Vivian accepted this offer with what I now understand was barely concealed relief. I packed a bag, told myself I was doing the mature thing, and moved into the apartment. What I didn't know, what I could not have imagined even in my most cynical moments, was that within weeks of my departure, Vivian had invited another man to move into the house I had spent years building, renovating, and paying for. I found out the way people find out things they weren't supposed to know in the modern era. A mutual friend sent me a screenshot. Then I went to Vivian's social media accounts myself, and what I found there hit me like a physical blow. There were photos, not just recent ones, photos that stretched back months. Vivian and a man named Derek laughing at restaurants, at events, on what appeared to be a weekend trip to a coastal resort that I definitely hadn't known about. The timestamps on some of these posts placed them squarely within our marriage. Not during our separation, during our marriage. While I had been lying awake at night trying to figure out what I could do differently to close the distance between us, Vivian had apparently been spending her weekends with someone else entirely. The realization arrived in stages, each one worse than the last. First, the shock of seeing the photos. Then the recognition of how long this had been going on. Then the understanding, cold, crystalline, and devastating, that Vivian's request for a divorce hadn't been about growing apart or finding herself. It had been about logistics, about clearing me out of the house so that Derek could move in, about transitioning from the life I had provided to the same life, with a different man in the primary role, while retaining all the financial security and comfort I had spent decades creating. I confronted her directly. I called Vivian and told her what I had found. I kept my voice steady. I was proud of that afterward. I didn't scream. I didn't fall apart. I simply told her that I had seen the photos, that I understood the timeline, and that I wanted her to explain herself. What I got back was not an explanation. It was aggression. Vivian told me, with a sharpness in her voice I had never heard before, a sharpness that suggested she had been waiting to drop the pretense of civility for quite some time, that I had no right to question how she chose to live her life now that we were separated, that her personal relationships were none of my business, that I should focus on the divorce proceedings and stop making things complicated. And then she said the thing that changed everything. She told me that Derek would be moving into the house permanently, that she fully expected to keep the house and the majority of our shared assets in the divorce settlement, that I should, and I'm quoting here as accurately as my memory allows, adjust my expectations. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The woman who had cheated on me during our marriage, who had planned the transition to her new relationship with the kind of organizational precision that she had apparently never applied to our actual partnership, was now telling me, in the house I had paid for, that she had invited her boyfriend to move into, that I should adjust my expectations. I stayed very calm on that phone call. Calmly, I told Vivian that I understood her position, that I would take everything she had said into consideration. And then I hung up the phone, sat in my business apartment in complete silence for about 4 minutes, and called my attorney. What followed was one of the most satisfying conversations I have ever had. My attorney, a sharp and unflappable woman named Patricia who had been advising me for years, reminded me with quiet precision of everything we had put in place. The house was owned by an LLC that predated our marriage by many years. Vivian had never had her name on the title, not because I had hidden this from her with malicious intent, but because that was simply how the asset had always been structured for legitimate business and liability protection reasons. My investment accounts were held in trusts. My business interests were insulated through entities that she had no legal claim to. The marital assets, the things we had actually accumulated together during our marriage, were real but limited. Patricia told me something I will never forget. She said, "Marcus, she built her expectations on a foundation she never actually verified. And that is not your legal problem." I authorized Patricia to take an aggressive approach to our divorce proceedings immediately. The generous settlement I had originally offered, the one I had extended in good faith, before I understood the full scope of what Vivian had been doing, was withdrawn. Entirely. We were starting over from the actual legal reality, not from my desire to be a kind ex-husband to someone who deserved kindness. The first thing I did after speaking with Patricia was go through every account, subscription, membership, and financial service that was in my name but that Vivian had access to or benefited from. I want to describe this process to you because it was methodical, and that methodicalness was its own form of satisfaction. The premium streaming services, gone. The luxury health insurance plan that covered her at a level far above what was legally required during separation, replaced with the minimum legally mandated coverage. The country club membership that she had been using to lunch with her new social circle, suspended. The credit card she had been using that was attached to my accounts, canceled. The car insurance policy that covered the vehicle she drove, adjusted to the legal minimum. The grocery delivery subscription, the premium gym membership, the wine club that sent monthly shipments to the house. All of it, canceled, one by one, in a single afternoon. I want to be honest. There was a part of me that had always been uncomfortable with the idea of pettiness. I had prided myself on being the kind of man who took the high road. But sitting there working through that list, I didn't feel petty. I felt precise. I was simply removing my financial support from a situation where it was no longer warranted, and doing so within the full bounds of the law. I'm told, through mutual friends who were still in contact with both of us, that Vivian's reaction when the cards started declining and the services started disappearing was spectacular. She apparently called Patricia's office in a fury, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. Patricia calmly informed her that I was doing exactly what the law permitted me to do during a separation when no temporary support agreement had yet been established, and that if Vivian's attorney wanted to discuss a temporary support arrangement, they were welcome to file the appropriate motions, which they did, and which we addressed in court with the full weight of the financial disclosures I had already prepared. Because here's what Vivian and her attorney had not anticipated. The financial disclosure process in a divorce requires full transparency about the nature of all assets. And when Patricia filed my disclosures, the picture they painted was nothing like what Vivian had been expecting. Every asset that Vivian had been counting on was detailed, along with its legal ownership structure, its creation date, and its relationship, or rather, its deliberate non-relationship, to our marital estate. The house she was living in, the house that Derek had moved his belongings into, the house where Vivian had apparently been redecorating certain rooms in anticipation of a long tenure, owned by an LLC that predated our marriage by a decade. Not a marital asset, not subject to equitable distribution. The investment accounts she had been mentally spending in her projected post-divorce lifestyle, held in trusts established years before we met. Not marital assets. The business income that had funded our lifestyle throughout our marriage, generated by entities she had no legal claim to whatsoever. What was left, the actual marital estate, was real but modest compared to what Vivian had been planning around. Savings accumulated during our marriage. Personal property. Things we had genuinely built together. I'm told that the meeting where Vivian's attorney explained this reality to her was not a pleasant one. I wasn't there, obviously, but the shift in the tone of the legal correspondence I received over the following weeks told a very clear story. The aggressive opening demands gave way to softer language. The confident posturing from her legal team became noticeably more measured, and the timeline of the proceedings stretched out as Vivian apparently went through several stages of processing what she had discovered. Meanwhile, the situation inside the house I legally owned through my LLC was becoming increasingly complicated for Vivian and Derek. Derek, it turned out, had been operating under a set of assumptions about Vivian's financial prospects that were proving to be significantly inaccurate. Mutual friends who remained in contact with both of us. People who, I want to be clear, were not feeding me information out of malice, but simply couldn't help but notice what was happening, began reporting that the atmosphere in the house had shifted considerably. The romantic excitement of the affair, the intoxicating thrill of the new relationship conducted in secret and then brought triumphantly into the open, had begun to curdle as the practical realities of their situation became apparent. Derek had apparently been attracted to Vivian, at least in part, by the lifestyle she represented. The nice house, the comfortable income, the security that comes from being partnered with someone whose finances are solid. He had been counting on a version of their future together that included a significant divorce settlement, a house they didn't have to pay market rent for, and the continuation of the elevated lifestyle that my money had been funding. When those things began to evaporate, when the settlement projections collapsed, when the LLC ownership of the house became clear, when the financial picture became something far less comfortable than what he had signed up for, Derek's commitment to the relationship became, shall we say, elastic. The friends who kept me loosely updated described a man who was increasingly absent, increasingly irritable, and increasingly focused on his own financial interests in ways that were not particularly considerate of Vivian's feelings. The grand romance had apparently lost some of its luster when it turned out to require actual sacrifice rather than just the enjoyment of someone else's resources. I want to be clear, I took no active pleasure in watching Vivian struggle, but I would be lying if I said there wasn't a deep, quiet satisfaction in knowing that the plan she had executed so carefully, the patient accumulation of a parallel relationship, the strategic timing of the divorce announcement, the confident expectation of a comfortable settlement, had collided with reality in ways she had never accounted for. The divorce proceedings ran for 18 months in total. 18 months of legal filings, financial disclosures, mediation sessions that went nowhere productive, and the slow grinding work of untangling two lives that had been intertwined for 8 years. Patricia was extraordinary throughout this process, methodical, unintimidated by Vivian's legal team's occasional attempts to introduce Vivian's adultery into arguments for greater support, and absolutely relentless in defending the legitimacy of every asset protection structure we had established. There was one moment, about 11 months into the proceedings, that I want to describe to you because it crystallized something important. Vivian requested an in-person meeting, not through attorneys, but directly between the two of us at a neutral location. Against Patricia's advice, I agreed to go. I was curious, honestly, about what she thought she could accomplish. We met at a coffee shop not far from the business district. Vivian arrived looking tired in a way I hadn't seen before. The confident, polished presentation she had always maintained was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. She looked like someone who had been running hard and had just realized the finish line was much farther away than she had calculated. She opened by telling me she was sorry. Not in the careful, legally sanitized language her attorney would have approved of. A real apology, stumbling, imperfect, with pauses where she seemed to be genuinely struggling to find the right words. She told me she had made a terrible mistake, that she had gotten caught up in something that had felt exciting and had lost sight of what was real, that she had underestimated what we had together and overestimated what she was moving toward. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt. I let her finish. And when she was done, I sat there for a moment in the particular silence that follows an apology that arrives too late to change anything. I told Vivian, quietly, without anger, that I had loved her genuinely. That when I had opened myself up to the possibility of a second marriage, after years of protective isolation following Renata's death, I had done it with everything I had. That I had believed in what we were building. And that the specific cruelty of her betrayal wasn't just the affair itself, but the calculation behind it. The fact that she had looked at our marriage and seen primarily a financial arrangement to be optimized rather than a partnership to be honored. I told her that I hoped she found what she was looking for. And I told her that I had made my peace with the outcome of our divorce, and that I didn't hold on to bitterness. But that reconciliation was not something I was able to offer her. She started to say something else. I thanked her for meeting with me, stood up, and left. I walked out of that coffee shop into a cold, clear afternoon, and I felt, for the first time since that Tuesday evening when she had sat me down and told me she wanted a divorce, entirely free. When the settlement was finally finalized, Vivian received what was legally appropriate and nothing more. She kept personal belongings from the house. She received her portion of the actual marital savings, the money we had genuinely accumulated together during our marriage. She received temporary spousal support for a period that Patricia had negotiated down significantly from what her team had initially demanded, set to expire on a clear timeline. She received nothing else. The house, my house, the one I had renovated and paid off through years of work and rebuilding after Renata's death, remained exactly where it had always legally been. In the LLC, in my control. Patricia filed the appropriate legal notices, and Vivian and Derek were given a formal timeline to vacate. I'm told the day they moved out was not a pleasant one. Derek had apparently already begun the process of distancing himself from Vivian before the final settlement was reached, and the shared move out of a house that neither of them had ever actually owned together was, by all accounts, conducted in an atmosphere of considerable tension. The great romance that had displaced my marriage ended not with drama or passion, but with boxes being loaded into a moving truck in uncomfortable silence. I did not go to the house that day. I didn't need to witness it. I had already won. In the months that followed, I began the process of reclaiming myself, the version of myself that had existed before the last difficult years of my marriage, before the constant low-grade stress of trying to hold together a partnership that had already been quietly abandoned by the other person in it. I threw myself back into my business with a focus and clarity that felt almost electric after years of distraction. I identified new markets, evaluated investment opportunities one had been putting off, expanded into 2 new commercial developments that my instincts told me were undervalued. The combination of renewed professional energy and the absence of the constant drain of a deteriorating marriage produced results that exceeded anything I had achieved in the previous 3 years. I reconnected with friends I had allowed to drift during the years when Vivian's social preferences had taken precedence. Old friends who knew me before the second marriage, before the grief, some of them from the early years of my career when everything was being built from scratch. These reconnections reminded me of something I had partially lost sight of during my marriage to Vivian. That the most meaningful relationships in my life had always been built on genuine affection and shared history, not on social performance or financial positioning. I started spending time differently. Early mornings at the gym instead of lying awake processing arguments about budgets. Weekend mornings working on the renovation of a property I had been neglecting because Vivian had found the project boring. Long dinners with people I actually wanted to talk to, about things that actually mattered to me. I realized with something approaching surprise, genuinely content. Not in the muted, managing expectations way I had been living for much of my second marriage's later years, but in the real, full, grounded way that comes from living a life that actually reflects who you are. About 2 years after the divorce was finalized, I received occasional updates about Vivian's situation through mutual acquaintances, information I never sought out, but that found its way to me through the inevitable small-world nature of shared social circles. She was working full-time now, for the first time in years. She was living in an apartment that was, by all accounts, a significant step down from the house she had expected to keep. The social circle she had cultivated so carefully during our marriage, the wealthy women with their luxury vacations and designer wardrobes, had largely evaporated once it became clear that Vivian's financial circumstances no longer matched the entry requirements of that particular world. Derek, I was told, was entirely out of the picture. Their relationship had not survived the collapse of the financial expectations that had apparently been a significant part of its foundation. The man who had moved into my house with such apparent confidence in his and Vivian's shared future had departed when that future revealed itself to be considerably less comfortable than advertised. I want to be careful here because it would be easy, and perhaps satisfying in a shallow way, to describe Vivian's circumstances with something like triumph. But the truth is more complicated than that. What I felt when I heard these updates was not triumph. It was something quieter and more final. It was the recognition that the consequences Vivian was experiencing were the natural results of choices she had made with full awareness, and that those consequences were neither my responsibility nor my victory. They simply were. What I did feel, strongly, and without apology, was gratitude for the decisions I had made years earlier, in the quiet aftermath of Renata's death, when I had sat down with an attorney and a financial advisor and done the unglamorous, painstaking work of protecting what I had built. Those decisions had not been made to trap Vivian or to prepare for a divorce I hadn't anticipated. They had been made because a man who had watched financial vulnerability compound personal grief understood, in his bones, that protection is not paranoia, it is responsibility. If I had not structured my assets the way I had, Vivian's attorneys would have had legitimate claims to approximately half of everything I owned. The house I had renovated with money earned before we ever met. The investment accounts I had built through years of risk and discipline. The business interests that were the direct result of decisions and sacrifices that predated Vivian by decades. All of it could have been subject to division, and a significant portion of it could have ended up funding the life she had planned to build with another man. Instead, it remained exactly where it belonged. There is something I want to say to anyone listening to this story who is in the early stages of building something, a business, a financial foundation, a life, and who is also navigating the complicated territory of relationships and marriage. The legal structures that protected me during my divorce were not weapons I kept hidden to use against Vivian. They were the architecture of a life I had built through genuine work, and they existed to protect that work from the various ways the world can try to take things from you. Protecting what you have built is not selfish. It is not cynical. It is the basic responsibility of someone who understands that wealth is not an accident, but a result. As for marriage, I made a decision after the divorce that I have not revisited since. I will not marry again. This is not a decision made in bitterness or in the kind of broad condemnation of all women that small, hurt men retreat into after difficult divorces. It is a decision made with clear eyes and full understanding. The legal structure of marriage creates obligations and vulnerabilities that I am no longer willing to accept. I can have meaningful relationships. I can have genuine connection, affection, and partnership. I do not need a legal contract to authenticate those things, and I will not create one that could be used to undo what I have spent a lifetime building. What I look for now, in friendships, in the women I spend time with, in the business partnerships I enter, is the same thing I should have been more rigorous about looking for in my marriage to Vivian: genuine mutual contribution, real reciprocity, the kind of connection that holds up when the external rewards of being connected are removed, because it is built on something more fundamental than convenience or calculation. I think about Renata sometimes, in the quiet evenings when the work is done and the apartment is still. I think about what she would make of everything that has happened. I believe she would be proud of the financial decisions I made. I believe she would understand the choice not to remarry. And I believe she would want me to find joy in the life I am living, not as a consolation for what was lost, but as the genuine, earned result of a man who has survived 2 different kinds of devastation and come out the other side with his integrity and his assets both intact. The money that Vivian had planned to walk away with, the settlement she and Derek had apparently been counting on to fund their life together, stayed exactly where it had always legally been. In the trusts, in the LLC, in the business entities that bore my name and reflected my decades of work, and in the house that Vivian vacated, the house I had renovated with my own resources after the hardest years of my life. I eventually arranged for a complete refresh. New paint, updated fixtures, the removal of every trace of the life that had been lived there by someone who had treated it as a temporary staging ground for a scheme rather than a home built with love. I walked through it alone the first evening after the work was complete, moving from room to room in the particular silence of a space that has been returned to itself. The light came through the windows at the angle I had always loved. The bones of the house, the structure I had poured so much of myself into, were exactly as they had always been. Solid, protected, mine. And standing there in that quiet, reclaimed space, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like myself again.